Welcome to Science on Screen at Film Streams, made possible through a grant from the Coolidge Corner Theater with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Today's presentation is Space Exploration, where science, culture, and imagination combine, by Mark Strahle, the Education Director at the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum. Mark's going to give us some context as we lead up to the film Voyage to the End of the Universe. In the year 2163, the starship Ikarie XB is sent to a mysterious white planet orbiting the star Alpha Centauri. Traveling at near light speed, the journey takes around 28 months for the astronauts, although the effects of relativity mean that 15 years will have elapsed on Earth by the time they reach their destination. During the flight, the 40-strong multinational crew must adjust to life in space, as well as dealing with various hazards they encounter, including a derelict 20th century spaceship armed with nuclear weapons, a deadly radioactive dark star, and a mental breakdown of one of the crew who threatens to destroy the spacecraft. Welcome Mark Strahle, Education Director at Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum.
All right. Hi, I'm Mark Strahle. I'm the Education Director at the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum in Ashland, Nebraska, off Interstate 80 at exit 426. Come on out and see us sometime. Today we're going to talk a little bit about science, space, culture, and imagination, where they all come together. Here at the museum, our mission is to preserve some 70 years of aerospace history. We also are looking at the future of where space and space travel might go. As we're dealing with that, we're going to be spending a few moments looking at our exhibit behind me. This is Space New Generation, the heritage of space travel. And just so you know, as we look at our movie today, we're going to be talking about how does imagination infer from science and space. As we voyage through our mind's eye, we're going to look hard at how imagination feeds science, technology, engineering, and math. And then, of course, we have the arts, in this case, film, i.e. STEAM. So, initially, we have the Mercury, Apollo, and Gemini programs that we're looking at. There was a space race following World War II. With the advent of the V-2 ballistic missile, we were able to deliver weapons over large distances in a way that couldn't be interfered with. When you lob a missile across the English Channel, but it goes almost all the way to space and then comes down, there's no way to shoot it, there's no way to hit it, there's no way to stop it. And that's why the V-2 was such an amazing terror weapon. It scared the heck out of people because there was no defense. Well, then, of course, in World War II, we saw the advent of nuclear weapons. When you marry a nuclear weapon, which formerly was delivered by bombers, you marry that to a ballistic missile, and you travel through space to deliver something against a target halfway around the Earth. Now you have a real scary package. Well, that package led to something called the Cold War, a clash of ideologies between communism and what we considered to be the rest of the Western or free world, led us to a point where both sides had nuclear weapons and both sides had ballistic missile delivery capability. And those delivery capabilities competed with each other to determine who could get the most going the fastest to the other side. Well, then it became important to have civil defense. It became important to have early warning radar so that you'd have time to react or respond to an attack by your enemy. We also learned that bombers still had a role in the world, because once you push the button and launch ballistic missiles, they're gone. You're not calling them back. Bombers could be put in the air, and they could be used to send a signal or a message to the other side, with whom we weren't communicating very well, and they weren't communicating very well with us. And so you end up with a clash of cultures, but you can still communicate by gesturing and using your bombers. So what we ended up with was a space race. We decided we had to have bigger, faster, farther, and more accurate, and so too did the former Soviet Union. This led to both sides spending inordinate amounts of money on weapons and weapons technology. And as we looked at our weapons and our weapons development, we also began to discover how technology is advanced by the pressures of war. Whether war is hot or war is cold, it forces or pushes us as we advance our technologies. At one point, the Soviet Union determined that they wanted to put a satellite into space, leave it up there, and see how long they could make it work. We ended up with a program called Sputnik. Sputnik launched a radio satellite into orbit, and as it circled the Earth on a certain frequency, it would beep intermittently so that you would know it was there. And that satellite could be used for measurements, that satellite could be used for other things, and that scared the heck out of the United States of America. Politicians and scientists alike suddenly realized that things could be put up in space, left up in space, and come back down at the whim or the will of a potential adversary or competitor. Well, we decided we wanted to compete on the high frontier. The high frontier of space became an effort to put a man into space. John F. Kennedy told us that he wanted to put a man in space in this decade or the next, and do the hard things as well, so that we would launch the United States into a new era of high technology, productivity, and prosperity for at least us and the so-called free world. So here's where we are today. We're looking at the outcome of the Mercury program, where we literally had what we called a man in a can. And we launched that man into space, sent him around the Earth a couple of times, brought him back down, and we proved that we could do it and have a man survive. Then we developed the Gemini program. The Gemini program put 2 men into space with the goal of one of them flying the spacecraft and one of them leaving the spacecraft to do things outside the environment inside a capsule. So we were able to put a man into a suit, carry his environment with him, and get him out of a spacecraft outside the atmosphere, move around through space, return to the spacecraft, close the lids, and then bring that spacecraft back down. And that eventually led to what we called the Apollo program. The Apollo program's goal was to get to the moon, put a man on the moon, recover that man, and then bring everyone back home safely. The longest journey humanity had ever performed. All of this is being driven by our Cold War attitudes towards the former Soviet Union and their attitudes towards us. That competition drove certain amounts of technological success. Let's back up for a minute and talk about the culture. At the same time, all of this is going on, and it's hugely important to ballistic missile technology, nuclear weapons delivery capability, simple humanity making long journeys. We were inspiring an entire culture to join us on this, what would have been super secret ride. Now we're getting the entire culture and population interested in a new frontier. We're not just exploring the planet Earth, but we're going beyond the planet Earth in ways we hadn't yet imagined. Now, if you go back to the 1930s or even earlier, you can find lots of culture in art, paint, sculpture, film. Science fiction began to develop as a form of literature. Science fiction becoming one of the most powerful forms of literature because the author builds the world in which he wants to examine a problem. And interestingly enough, we use science fiction even today to do the same thing. We identify issues within our society, and sometimes we create alternate histories in a fake universe or an alternate universe, and then we can explore what the outcomes might have been. But I digress. Back to space. Space is driving the culture. There's this imagination out there starting in the 1930s with a fellow named Chesley Bonestel. And Chesley was doing all kinds of artwork. He was doing some fantastic painting and drawing and such that would lead us into space. Some of his artist conceptions were so thoroughly researched that if you were standing on a moon around a planet, you could see other moons in the background. Or if the moon were in the correct position, you could identify the sun. or what we now call the plane of the elliptic, so you could see what the solar system's plane looks like. He worked these into his artistic renderings so that people could begin to understand what it would take and how far away we really would be from the place where we've grown and evolved. That also went into film. In film, we're looking at an old movie known as the Journey to the Moon, an attempt to identify how we might make a travel to get to the moon. And the concept in that film was to take something like a train with a locomotive at the front, put it in a large cannon, load it up with a lot of explosives, and put some people in it, and then shoot that thing into space. It would fly to the moon. Once arriving at the moon, it would land or crash, as it were. And we identified early on that we hypothesized that the moon's gravity would be lower. We hypothesized some other ideas about what the moon might be like. And these people traveled to the moon, tourists in space essentially, got out, walked around the moon, enjoyed themselves a little bit, met the moon people, and then got back into their vehicle and flew or launched and flew back home. Well, that was an early attempt to try and share space travel with the rest of society. Well, that picked up not only in the free world, but also on the other side of the world, behind what we used to call the Iron Curtain. So as science fiction is advancing, science art is advancing, and we move towards higher and higher technology, we weren't the only ones imagining what a world in space might be like. So as that was going on, we're still pushing this technology. Interestingly enough, a couple of things that are less technical than you might expect. The Mercury space program, almost entirely done with pencil and paper. Lots of hot coffee, lots of nicotine, lots of smoke-filled rooms with people just trying to figure out how to do things on slide rules, which oftentimes are not direct calculations, but are logarithmic or algorithmic approximations of what we're attempting to do to put a man in space, put him on a ballistic arc, send him out of the atmosphere, and then bring him back home. That's all being done without computers. It's being done in the minds of engineers and designers. So we're looking at the arts and we're saying, wow, are the arts driving these ideas, or are these ideas driving arts? But hand in hand, we're developing these new technologies. If we want to go to the moon, we need even more technology. So we began building calculating machines that were electronic, with the goal of doing more and faster calculations than were capable at the time with simple mechanical adding devices, like adding machines and mechanical cash registers. So all this is being driven by a program to get farther and faster into space, all of which is also being harvested for advances in weapons delivery technology. It's important to remember that this was because of competition that our technology grew. Science, arts, imagination, all in concert with each other. So eventually we get to the Apollo program, and behind me you're going to see Apollo 009. The Apollo capsule over my right shoulder. That capsule actually went to space, but because it's a 00 number, it means, and we know, that it was only a tester. So it was full of equipment to determine what conditions would be like and if the capsule would respond as we hoped before we sent a capsule up with men in it. The mission was very successful. They were able to maintain telemetry or radio contact with the capsule. They were able to do things remotely from mission control. They were able to capture all the information they wanted and prove that not only was the capsule going to support life, but that upon re-entry, it would also prevent the passing of any of the astronauts contained therein. So we're very happy to have that artifact. Eventually, we started the program. We launched into space with manned Apollo astronauts. We then made a journey all the way to the moon and flew around the moon and came back home without landing anyone, but taking all the equipment necessary for a moon landing just to prove we could do it. Then we finally launched Apollo 11. Apollo 11 made the journey to the moon, dropped off the lunar landing module. Neil Armstrong made his famous climb down the ladder and placed his foot on the moon. and we could say we had arrived. We planted a flag, we made observations, we left experiments, including reflectors that we can still use as laser measuring devices to this day. We also discovered that we could bounce ham radio signals off of the moon. So from your armchair in your home, maybe in your office, maybe in your study, you could use a radio and bounce a signal off the moon and measure the time it took to make that travel. That inspired all sorts of things. People were just gobsmacked, absolutely in love with the idea of space. We've got Buck Rogers rolling in video or in film and on TV. We've got the Jetsons. We eventually come up with this idea of a unified humanity under the Federation or the United Federation of Planets, i.e. Star Trek. And a whole new idea was born. So here at the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum, we have the opportunity to not only look at the development of Strategic Air Command over the period 1946 to 1992 and the subsequent establishment of the Strategic Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Bellevue, Nebraska, but we also have a telescope through which we can view aerospace history, the culture, the patterns, the art, the history, the imagination. And we'd like you to come out and join us at the museum so that you can experience what we have to offer in our 300,000 square foot facility with over 34 major artifacts from the United States Air Force and some 25,000 artifacts in our general collection, of which about 5,000 are on display. So the museum is partnering with Film Streams in order to bring you this selection of a movie from Czechoslovakia, the Czechoslovakian Film Archives, the 1966 production of Voyage to the Edge of the Universe. We anticipate that this will give you some inspiration, and that's one of the things we try to provide at the museum. We hope as you look at it, you identify some ideas about a small communist country and what their vision of a space utopia might look like sometime in the 22nd century. Thank you very much.